Alrighty, this will be the second part to the lecture series. We're going to just continue right on from where we were. So, last time we were talking about political neutrality. We were talking about, sort of the responsibility of educators to retain political neutrality. And I would sort of just want to refresh everyone's memory a little bit within political neutrality. Sort of this idea that in order for us to receive an individual, unbiased education, political neutrality is required. And again, just sort of drawing it back in, I can point to exactly within our society where the lack of political neutrality has created some issues. Last election, which was, God, 2 years ago at this point, almost, there was a lot of contention, especially since the votes weren't counted for like a week. So there was a lot of, you know, there was a lot of lack of evidence. There was a lot of, I'd say, shouting. There was a lot of anger around everything. And I don't want to point to these people's education, but I will say that a lot of the individuals who ended up engaging in verbal and, in some cases, physical confrontations were taught in a very certain way under a very certain set of rules. People who were very, very conservative from very, very conservative regions were in confrontation with people who were very liberal from very, very liberal regions. And I believe that those educations along those lines led directly to the problem. And sort of, and again, I'm not sure of the efficacy of this article in particular. I'm sort of skeptical on it, but I like what it starts to point out. This one is definitely very right of center. I just reading it alone, I can tell that much. But it does raise a very, very good point, which is, are we responsible in judging history from a modern standard? Obviously, anyone with a brain would be like, well, no, we shouldn't judge it with a modern standard. That doesn't make any sense. Why would we judge someone's decision 200 years ago by the decision today? That doesn't make any sense. Unfortunately, the rational person is not always the loudest. Uh, and again, this has been seen everywhere. You've seen people toppling statues, burning buildings, screaming in protests in the streets. And I'm not going to say that these people have wrong opinions. I'm not here to discuss any sort of deal with that. But what I am here to say is that um, they have all engaged in a very similar action, which is judging the decisions of our forefathers, people in the past generations, by modern standards, which isn't fair at all. And in this article, it goes on to talk about mostly what's been going on. Were we more moral back then versus now? Would we have won all these conflicts? It's comparing the two generations and saying it's really just not fair to lump us all together. The second article, though, I believe, puts it pretty much in a good context. Um, so this little piece is from Prussian called Immanuel Kant. He is a philosopher, pretty influential if you know who he is, but we have a quote from him, and I'm just gonna put this one out here for everyone to see. Women should leave reasoning to men, as they are not fit for serious employment. Seems pretty, especially by modern standard, that seems like a pretty yikes kind of statement. Like, you wouldn't make that kind of statement today. It's pretty sexist. We'd all argue. But this man didn't live in 2021, he lived in the 1700s. And by 1700 standards, that's pretty much par for the course. That's pretty orthodoxy, as you would say. Now, that's a pretty, I'd say, antiquated example, so I'd like to pull then another one. Should the British government apologize for how they treated Turing? Alan Turing, mathematician, brilliant guy, basically cracked Enigma, was charged with homosexuality in 1952, and then unfortunately he ended his own life. Are they then responsible for apologizing? Are they then uh, responsible for how they treated him? Some people say yes, some people say no. Yes, even though it's not our people who did this thing to them, we have a responsibility to show our apology, or no, it happened in the past, sucks it happened, terrible thing that happened, but it's not our problem. So I suppose the whole idea of this is, where does our responsibility begin, uh, and where does our analysis begin? And this is sort of how political neutrality gets the aforementioned gasoline thrown on it. Is, how much responsibility do we take for what has happened? It's easy to say, well, we need to take responsibility for something that happened 2 years ago. That makes sense. We were all alive 2 years ago, but what about 20 years ago? I wasn't alive 20 years ago. Why should it be my fault? Or even 30 years ago. A lot of people were like very young 30 years ago. So again, why is it our fault? So we have to begin asking ourselves those questions. So where does our responsibility end and begin? And so that idea of demonization of history by analysis through a modern context is flawed. So I believe, to understand this, we really have to study history, learn history, understand what is being told to us, and sort of put it in the eyes of the people we are reading. So you really need to, and I know multiple teachers have told you this over the years, but you do kind of have to take this to heart, is you need to become that person. You need to really understand what that person was living through, what the context was, what the people around him were saying. Because once you understand that, I believe you can sort of begin to crack, okay, was his views orthodox for the times, or was he a little bit of a nutter? Because granted, even for the time period, there are individuals who said and did things that weren't even acceptable by their standards. So then those people can be held to a responsible standard. So much like political neutrality, achieving that perfect synthesis, in this case, we need to understand and judge based on the standards of that time versus this time versus the time in the future, and assign responsibility only based on what they had access to and where they had access to it. And in the next sector, we're going to be talking about, my apologies, we're going to be talking about State Departments, which, oh boy, I can't wait to talk about this one. Sort of their failings, sort of how slow they are to change, and of course a few in-person examples of that slow to change, and sort of how we dance around that issue. And then that, of course, will lead into our solutions. So stay tuned for part 3.